Thank you all for joining this evening from wherever you're joining from. I recognise a few names and faces, so that's quite nice. I'm going to be telling, oh, sorry, I can just hear, if everyone could just mute themselves so we don't get any noise. I'm going to be telling you a bit about some of my work that I do from Bournemouth University. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher there, and I was also lucky enough to do my PhD there. So this work kind of crosses both of those roles of mine. So my thesis was about population ecology and the behaviour of the European barbel, which are recreationally important and translocated fish. So I'm going to be telling you today about their movement and diet, and how some of the individuals have certain specializations in this disconnected and subsidized world. And disconnected because we have a few barriers in the system that I've been researching in. Some of the weirs, one of which is in the picture on the right hand side, and subsidized in the way of the food that comes into the river where they're feeding. So they're not just eating the freshwater food that's available, but some food that finds its way in from people, and also that comes in from the sea. So I'm going to be telling you a bit more about all of those. And the picture in the middle, obviously, is the star of the show. That is the European barbel. So there are many species of barbel across Europe, but in the UK, we just have this one, which is Barbus. And we've also got some of the logos of the partners that I work with. We don't just work on our own at the university. We work with all these groups like the environment agencies, some of the specialist fishing groups like the Barbel Society and the Severn Rivers Trust, which have all helped facilitate some of this work. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, the barbel that I'm going to be talking about are not native to the western flowing rivers of the UK. So they have a range across Europe, and they're kind of invading south into Italy. And naturally, they'd only colonized into our eastern flowing rivers. But because they're not really very tolerant to salt water, they hadn't managed to naturally get around to the west coast. And so it was only by people that they managed to get into the River Severn. So in the 1950s, the Rivers Authority at the time decided that they would bring some barbel from the River Kennet into the River Severn, and that they hoped this would provide a good angling opportunity for the people that lived around the River Severn. So they moved about 500 barbel, and the picture is actually one of the fish that was introduced into the river, and it provided lots of recreational angling opportunities. And then they managed to naturally move up one of the tributaries, so the River Teme, and they were able to colonize there and breed there successfully. And the populations have kind of naturally sustained themselves until this day, with very few additional stockings happening after that. And then what I was interested in was some of the movement of these fish. So people had previously studied the movement in their kind of more native range. So studies have been done in Belgium, in the River Orth, and also in the UK in the River Ouse. But we don't really know much about how these fish move outside of their native range. But the previous studies had found that within a population, there would often be one group that were very active, very mobile, moving up and down the river a lot, and others that were quite sedentary and almost a lazy group that stayed in a very small location and were not really keen to go exploring. So some of my questions were about how variable the movement patterns would be between the different barbel in the lower River Teme and River Severn. What might be driving the variations in home range and total movement? And I'll tell you in a moment about how I measured the range and the movement. And also if there could maybe be a link between the ways that we catch fish, the things that they eat, and the movement that they then carry out. And then just a bit of an introduction on the kind of disconnected part of the talk and the barriers or potential barriers to migration. So there are two different barriers within the system that I was looking in. And one is Powick Weir, which is in that picture in the top right-hand corner. And so this is in the River Teme, which is a kind of a smaller tributary of the River Severn. And the barrier has been there for a very long time. So since 1475, it was put in by the prior of Great Malvern Abbey. and they dug this channel so that they could divert some water from the River Teme over to the mill at Powick, which is in the other picture there. And at the time that was to grind grain into flour so that they could make bread. And then over the years, it's had many different uses. At one point, it was used in manufacturing iron for some of the industry that was happening. And then in 1894, it was converted into a hydroelectric power station. And at the time, it was the biggest hydroelectric station within the UK. So it's got some fascinating history. But that hydroelectric station was decommissioned in 1920. So for the last 100 years, that barrier hasn't really had much of a function, although obviously it's got really interesting history. And then the other weir, which isn't pictured here, but I will show it to you in some of the following slides, was put in much later, so in the 1840s. And that was predominantly with a series of other weirs to help with navigation so that boats could come up the River Severn to deliver things like fuel up to places like Worcester. So why are weirs important? We know that weirs and dams all around the world are providing a big issue for fish that migrate. And most of the time we think about fish that are doing really huge movements like the salmon that are well known for their migration coming back from the sea into the river so that they can carry out their breeding. But there's not so much evidence around how these barriers affect other types of fish, so what we would call non-salmonids, which barbel are. And we don't really know about how different barriers might have different obstacles for barbel, and are they structure specific? And how might fish be responding when we remove these barriers and do kind of restoration techniques on the river to make it more natural? Might that then allow these kind of potentially non-native fish to get further upstream? So some of my questions were around, do both of these weirs in the system affect the movement of barbel equally? Are there certain environmental conditions where they can successfully pass over the weirs, or is it the same all year round? And whether maybe individual barbel pass structures within different ways. And then post removal, how do the fish move then? So just to tell you a bit about barbel ecology, if anyone's not heard the word ecology before, it's just about how animals interact with their environment. So yeah, they're a freshwater lithophilic cyprinid. Lithophilic meaning that they love gravel, so they often feed within the gravel and they lay their eggs within the gravel as well. And cyprinid, the family, includes carp and barbel and chub and quite a few other freshwater fish that generally just stay within freshwater. And they do migrate upstream still, so they will often travel further upstream to get to the ideal spawning gravel where they can lay their eggs, and they'll often all, many of them will group together to do that at the same time. And now I mentioned a bit about subsidies. So you think of, it's a freshwater fish, you would assume they ate freshwater food, but they actually get some additional things from the marine kind of food webs coming in. So anadromous fish are fish that come from the sea to breed in the river, and catadromous fish are fish that live in the river and then go out to sea to breed. And we think that both of these might subsidize the food webs of barbel. I was just chatting to an angler yesterday who thinks that barbel might feed upon sea lamprey that come in and spawn in the river. Once they die and they're literally decaying in the river, that the barbel might come and kind of suck the decaying flesh off of those. That's a lovely image for you all. And that they might even eat small elvers as they're migrating back into the rivers. But we also know that barbel eat a lot of marine fish meal pellets, and that's because anglers use them to attract the fish so they can catch them. But generally, barbel have got this downturned mouth with the four barbels kind of sticking out around the mouth to help them kind of taste what's in the gravel below them. And they'll eat a lot of invertebrates and some kind of detritus, so just general kind of mud and algae that they find upon the rocks. And we also know that barbel will occasionally eat very small freshwater fish, things like minnow, but we don't really think of barbel to be a kind of predatory fish. So these are just some of the methods that we use to study the barbel. When 2015, at the beginning of my PhD, we went out and caught 22 barbel from the river Teme, and we did this with 2 different methods. So we used electric fishing, which kind of makes the fish lose balance and enables us to capture it without really damaging the fish. And then we also worked with the recreational anglers that fish around the Teme for them to catch some fish as well. And we had about half of the fish caught by each method. And then we measured the size of all the fish. We picked up quite a good size range from about 30 centimeters to 72 centimeters. So we could find out about how the size of fish could affect their movement. And then we took some of their scales. Now, their scales are able to regrow and it doesn't really damage the fish too much. So it's an ideal thing for us to take as a sample and not cause too much damage. And we can get a lot of information from these scales. So firstly, they grow in kind of concentric rings like a tree grows. And so in the center, that's kind of the tissue that was laid when it was the youngest. And on the outer edges of the scale is the tissue that it's kind of established in the most recent times. And so we can take just the edge of the scale and we can actually find out what they've eaten through doing a chemical analysis. It's called stable isotope analysis. We basically can look at the ratios of carbon and nitrogen in that tissue, and then we compare it with the carbon and nitrogen in some of the food sources that they might be eating. So we took things like freshwater invertebrates, like little shrimp in the picture there, and then we took some freshwater fish like minnow, and we also took a couple of different types of fish meal pellets that we knew the anglers were using, and we could analyze all of those to find out what the fish had been eating. And then we anesthetize the fish that we'd captured, and we actually perform a kind of minor surgery on them to implant these tags. So that's the tag in the top picture there. It's quite zoomed in. They're actually very small. And these are going to transmit an acoustic sound in the water. So it's basically a ping signal, and that enables us to identify each fish uniquely. So we have a big kind of paddling pool or tank on the side of the river, and we recover the fish within there and make sure that they're recovered well from their procedure. And then they're released back into the river in a similar location to where we caught them, so we can find out where they go next. And then we have a range of these receivers or kind of listening stations in the river that are waiting for a fish to pass relatively nearby. And so it can record, okay, fish number, 72 came past on this day at this time. And then we have these receivers all throughout the river. So we know at the end of the day, a lot of different locations and which fish went where and on which days. And then we get a huge amount of data, which we process into something much simpler than this. But if we don't keep picking up a fish all throughout the year, then we won't include it in our analysis. Fish could have been eaten by predators, removed by maybe illegal angling, because most of the anglers practice catch and release on barbel, so they're not generally taken out, but it could happen. And so we actually, for 4 of our fish, we didn't include them in the rest of what I'm going to tell you about today. And so these were some of the metrics that we kind of calculated from that movement within a year. So firstly, we wanted to find out the kind of home range or total range that the fish moved. So if we have a receiver A and a receiver B, and I only get a detection from fish at receiver A and B, then I can measure that distance down the river. And we always do it as the direction that the fish would swim, not as the crow flies. And if that distance was 600 meters and that fish wasn't picked up anywhere else, then that would be the home range I would record. But we would also want to know things like the total movement, which is more of a reflection of overall activity. And apart from just recording the one downstream movement from A to B, if it was then picked up at A again and then B for the final time, I would know I could just times the range by 3, and that would be 1,800 meters, just for an example to demonstrate the 2 different metrics that I'm going to talk about. So these were some of my results about how length was going to be affecting movement. I kind of hypothesized that maybe larger fish, have got larger muscles and they might move within a much larger area of the river. But when I looked at home range, I didn't really find any significant pattern between the length of fish and the range that they move in, or between the length of fish and their total movement. But what was interesting from the kind of initial findings that we pulled out was just about how variable they were. And so with the home range, there would be some fish that moved less than a kilometre within a whole year, and some fish that moved 12 kilometres. So a real range, and it didn't seem to be due to length. And then with the total movement, so that was including all the kind of back and forths, there were some fish that moved less than 20 kilometres and others that moved up to 68. So really variable movement. So then trying to understand why those movements were really different. I mentioned we caught the fish with two different methods. So where I have AC there, that was the angler caught fish, and wherever in EF, they were the fish caught with electric fishing. And this is just about how many pellets we think they have eaten in their diet. So not hugely surprisingly, the angler caught fish have got more pellets in the diet than the fish we caught from electric fishing. But it was interesting that it seemed that the two methods had actually picked up fish with different maybe overall diets, and that there were fish in the river that were caught with electric fishing, which is a more kind of passive gear, it would collect all kinds of behaviors, and they maybe had a more natural diet, and actually not all fish are taking these pellets. Maybe they don't have a taste for that marine flavor, or maybe it's quite a strange food source for them. It's maybe more of an exploratory fish that would take that kind of bait. So we knew that there was kind of a different diet between the two fish. And then when we looked at the movement, we also found that the annual home range of these fish was different. And in this example, it was the fish from electric fishing that had a larger home range. So those fish with the more natural diet maybe had to move further to get enough resources to carry out all the things they need to do, like breeding and swimming around the river. So then I wanted to test if it could really maybe be down to these pellets that was affecting their movement. But when I plotted the kind of proportion of pellet in the diet with the annual home range, again, we didn't find a clear pattern within that. So it's maybe more about these kind of two groups of behavior rather than the actual diet specifically impacting upon where they moved. And now coming on to the potential barriers to migration. So these are images that we've taken from a drone from above. And the one on the left is Powick Weir. So this is in the River Teme in the tributary. And it's about 3 meters high. And on the kind of bottom lower left, it looks like a flat concrete kind of path there. But below that is actually what we call a fish pass. And it's a kind of staggering of concrete bars underneath there, which helps fish to swim up it. These are generally designed for salmon and fish related to salmon, which are really good, strong swimmers, obviously because they've adapted to swim all the way from sea up to rivers. But barbel and other kind of cyprinid families are maybe not as strong swimmers. So we're not really sure if these fish passes like that would work for barbel. And you can see there's also, or maybe you can't see, it's quite a small image, but there are boulders on the top of that weir. So it's helping to kind of maybe make it a more natural flow, or at least create a bit of diversity within the flow. So that we kind of visually, you would think it might be semi-useful for a fish to swim over. And then on the right hand side, that's Diglis Weir, which is in the River Severn, which is a much deeper, wider river. You can see the kind of concrete edges of it. It's a very straight river. And the weir itself has got a very flat, uniform surface as well. And there was no fish pass on this at the time, but there was a a boat lock adjacent, which is just out of sight, which is functioning to allow the boats to pass through. So it does open and close. So you might think a fish might be able to go in there, but it would have to time it directly with when it opened. And also, obviously, it only really opens when a boat is going in, at which time there's normally a loud engine noise, which we imagine would kind of scare a fish away. So we wouldn't really have thought it would go through the lock, but we thought we would check and find out. So this is what we found. So from the 22 barbel that we tagged, which kind of ended up being 18 fish that we knew about their movement over a longer time period, we found that for the Powick weir, we had 7 barbel approach the weir. Now, we can't necessarily say that they were attempting to go upstream because we don't know their intentions, but we know that they went downstream of the weir. And then we had 3 barbel that went over the weir, which at the time we were actually quite surprised that that many of them, because it's almost half of the fish, were able to ascend it. And then coming back down the river in the other direction, we found 2 of the barbel came back down. So we could say maybe Powick was a partial barrier to movement. But then we had a similar number of fish approach Diglis weir, so 6 of them, and none of the barbel within those 2 years successfully ascended that weir, and none of them came through the boat lock either. So it seemed to be a full barrier to barbel migration. So then I was interested in what environmental conditions might allow them to go over the weir. It was kind of discussed that during the winter you can barely see the weir because the river level gets so high that the fish will be able to just swim over the top of it. But I found that, so sorry, here I've got bar graphs, and on the left-hand side, 0 is an unsuccessful passage or approach, and the 1s show when a fish actually went over the weir. So the first plot on the left is the flow, and we didn't really find any significant differences between the flow of when they approached or when they could ascend. So it might be that the weir is really easily passable under high flow, but if the fish hasn't got any driver or any reason to ascend during the winter, then maybe it just wasn't attractive enough to make that kind of effort to move upstream. But then when we look at the water temperature and the day length, they were significant. So day length is just a kind of indicator of what time of year they went over. And the 3 fish that passed all went up at the end of March and beginning of April, which is when in the literature we know that barbel carry out this pre-spawning upstream migration. So they probably passed the barrier so that they could find a really good spawning gravel to put their eggs. And spawning, or the laying of eggs, is initiated by temperature in fish because they're an ectotherm. They want to put their eggs in the river at the best temperature for the development of the egg. So at about 13.5 degrees, they generally want to be laying their eggs. So prior to that, they need to get up to the right space. So yeah, it was good to find out that the temperature and the time of year was what was important. And now you would think that what goes up must come back down again, but only 2 of the 3 fish that went over the weir came back down. Whether that 1 fish just chose to make its home range further upstream, or whether it got predated upon when it was up there, we don't really know. But because we weren't expecting so much upstream passage, we didn't have that many receivers or listening stations further upstream. But the 2 fish that did come back down came down at really different times of year. Now in science, this is such a small sample size, it wouldn't be very useful, but it is quite interesting from an anecdotal point of view that the one that came down in the winter during the high flow came down straight over the top of the weir. So this is when the weir wouldn't really be visible. But the one that had come down in the summer when the river level was very low, it stayed at the top of the weir for 11 hours longer. And then it eventually came down through what we call the mill leap, but which is this very small side channel. And we'd not found any other fish go into that side channel before. So we hadn't really thought it was good, barbel habitat for feeding or spawning. But presumably when this fish couldn't find any other suitable way over the weir, the mill leap seemed attractive at that point. So then in 2018, this weir planned to be completely removed. And it wasn't just about barbel movement, it was about allowing the movement of lots of fish, but especially one called the Thwaite shad, which is very rare and still spawns within the River Teme. So it was a big project called Unlocking the River Severn. And there were a few concerns around how removing the weir would change the flow upstream and the kind of geology of the river. and some of the anglers worried that it might actually reduce the kind of chances of capturing the fish around the weir. So eventually it was just a partial removal, and once the diggers had gone, this is kind of what the weir looked like on the right. So it looks quite nice and natural and flat. And so we tagged 20 more barbel, and we looked to see how this restoration would affect their movement. And so the bit at the bottom, I've added on kind of what we found from those fish after we tracked them for 2 years. And so we tagged 2 less fish, but actually more fish approached the weir. So we had 9 approach the weir, and actually only 2 barbel ascended the weir under the restored or kind of partially removed weir. And both of those fish came back down again. So it might seem like actually less fish passed over the weir, so maybe it wasn't a useful thing to do. But the individuals that did pass didn't just pass up during the spawning migration. They actually made multiple ascents and descents. So we had a barbel that went up in the September, the April, and the June. So it could be that now not only do they feel it's worth spending the energy to go up there to spawn, but maybe they are incorporating it into their home range or going up there for other opportunities like feeding. And what was also really interesting was we still looked at Diglis weir, even though during this time frame there was no restoration on that weir. And we found a similar number approached the weir, so 5 fish approached, but 1 barbel actually successfully ascended. And it didn't just ascend once, it actually ascended multiple times. So now with the whole sample size of 11 fish, we had 1 fish that had ascended. So why was that? So these plots are looking at the flow that the fish approach the weirs at. So the red dots are when they approached but didn't ascend, and the blue dots are when they did ascend. And from the 2 on the left that are at Powick Weir, you might notice that the top plot has got a lot more red dots on it. So even though in 2018 less fish actually ascended, we also had less fish approach and not be able to ascend. So possibly reduced number of blocked passages. And also I know it's quite hard to see because the dots aren't very big, so I've added an arrow in here, but we had 1 ascent of a barbel going up at a much lower flow than what we'd had in 2015. So it could be that actually the kind of partial removal of the weir enabled the barbel to actually go up during lower flows, which are generally the conditions that they might approach at during the spring and summer. And then at Diglis Weir, even though the actual flow conditions were very similar between the 2 years, in 2015, no barbel had happened to approach the weir under the high flow conditions, whereas in 2018, 1 barbel did approach during these really high conditions, and actually it was able to successfully ascend during those. So it wasn't that there were different conditions available, just that the barbel hadn't attempted it during those flow conditions before. And now I just wanted to show you, so obviously a lot of our kind of scientific outputs are really dry papers. And obviously there's a thesis which is available to read, but it's not very easily interpreted by the public or people that might be interested in the fish's movement. So I've worked really hard to create this animation with a grant from the British Ecological Society. And I'm just going to show it to you now, and I'll provide the link at the end of the talk so that you can go and have a look at this if you want to as well. But basically we've got this bit of the map here. So you can move around to any part of the river that you might be interested in. So for example, here is Diglis Loch. And this is actually Powick Weir here, which is marked with the little red cross. And then you can look at different times of year on the river. And you can select which fish you might be interested in. And you can even select the temperature or flow that you want to look at. And you can look at before or after the Powick Weir was removed. And then you can click on these bubbles and it will tell you which fish were here and what their sizes were. And you can even look at what temperature and flow it was at this day when you're looking at this fish. And then what we imagine most people might be interested to do is to just play the animation and look at how fish move within the river. So we've even created the shape of the fish to match their kind of outlines. And yeah, this is during the spring, in March, when these barbels should be kind of starting to think about doing their spawning migrations. And then you've got some other fish moving much quicker. And the kind of shad and lamprey, which are the very carry out these really big migrations coming in from the sea to spawn in the rivers. Once they start moving in the river, they move much quicker than these barbel. And you can see how busy the system gets, bit like a motorway with all these fish moving up and down. And then removing weirs doesn't just allow for fish movement, also allows for the movement of sediment to travel more naturally within the river. So before the river was removed, we carried out a kind of habitat mapping exercise, and we fly the drone up and down the river, and we can kind of stitch all the pictures together. And then we also walk up the river and make a note of all the habitats that we find. Now, barbels tend to want to lay their eggs in a quite shallow, gravelly area, and it needs to have quite clean gravel so that the eggs have got lots of available oxygen to help them breathe and develop. And so in a natural kind of stretch of river, you get what we call a pool and riffle sequence. So like hills and valleys almost, but within the riverbed. And when we surveyed upstream of the weir, within the first 2 kilometres upstream of the weir, it was almost exclusively what we would call a deep glide habitat, which isn't suitable spawning habitat. So if you just think about those couple of fish that went to that huge effort of going over the weir, actually they then might have had to travel quite a lot further to access the first spot to do their spawning in. So we're hoping to go back and monitor the weir post removal. We wanted to go last year, but obviously because of COVID, that was a bit tricky. So we're hoping we can do it this May to see if there are increased amount of spawning habitat available for barbel, but also lots of other fish spawn on those riffles, like the rare Thwaite shad and the sea lamprey as well. So it could be providing spawning habitat for a whole range of fish species. And yeah, if it is creating spawning gravels for barbel, this is the kind of thing that we see when they're spawning in the gravels, this kind of flushing out of fine sediment where they're cleaning out the gravel for their eggs to go in. And that's just a picture of a very young barbel. And so everyone wants to see more of them in the river. They're just really cute. And so Diglis weir, so the weir that I mentioned that was in the River Severn, hadn't been edited through that time period that I've already shown the results from. But now it's undergoing this huge restoration project, and it's having this huge fish path put in. And it's hoped to be able to create passage for lots of different species of fish. So not just salmon and not just shad, but we're hoping the barbel can also migrate upstream around Diglis now, or more barbel will be able to get upstream under lots of different conditions. And it's going to be a really exciting project because it's going to be the UK's first underwater fish viewing gallery, which I think is really important because the freshwater fish are kind of a forgotten part of our wildlife because they're so out of sight. It's really hard for the general public to see them and get excited about them. So it tends to just be the anglers that have the opportunity to look at them. But this will enable an opportunity for anyone who goes to Worcester to be able to go down and hopefully have a look at fish when they're migrating. And they're hoping it's going to open this year. So I know we're all a bit worried about not going abroad with COVID, but when we've got exciting things like this on the doorstep, it just doesn't matter. And so we've been back and we've tagged even more barbel. So we're carrying on collaborating with our original partners, but also working with Hull, who have an international fisheries institute research group, and just the general Unlocking the Severn project. And yeah, we were just there for the last 2 days trying to catch some more barbel. Unfortunately, it had got a bit cold and we didn't get any takes on the bite, but hopefully we'll be able to go back in the spring and capture some. So yeah, that's just a bit of a shout out really to all of the fantastic people that have helped. It's certainly not you know, a one-person job doing this kind of work. So lots of people to be grateful to. And with that, I think I'll hand back over to Sharon, who's going to coordinate the break.
Thanks very much for a really interesting talk, and we didn't need to get our feet wet. Yeah, we're going to have a 5-minute break, just so that we can so Katie can actually have a breath, have something, a quick drink, so before we start with the questions. And yeah, we'll be back at 1:45. So in the meantime, if you want to add some questions, we've already got some in the chat. So if you want to add some questions to the chat, and we'll deal with them after the break. Katie, there's just been a question that you might want to put in the chat as a link to some of your publications around this area. There's a couple of people that are interested, so
yeah, definitely, I can put those links in.
Best place to find them. That's great. Okay, so we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I'm sort of trying to fiercely put together some grouping of questions. There's a couple of questions around the reintroduction of beavers and what influence you think that might have on migratory patterns in fish species, and whether or not there's any link up with these efforts about removing obstacles in the waterways. I think I've managed to summarize that.
Yeah, I've not worked on the beaver kind of dam, so I don't really have a really informed you know, answer for you. But it seems that they, you know, obviously they're much more gappy than a weir or a concrete structure would be. So hopefully within those small gaps and crevices, fish can pass through. But yeah, not really my expertise. I think so far where the beavers have been introduced isn't really in any areas where they have barbel. I think mostly it's been on kind of smaller streams where we don't really tend to have a lot of barbel, but it would be really interesting to look at. And certainly if anybody wanted to pay me, I would go and tag some fish there.
And I think you've got a volunteer that's offering to help you out with the project as well.
Great.
So yeah, Peter, do you want to come in with your questions, because you were willing to say something?
Yeah, I've got a couple of, well, some questions from facts. I've been a fisherman for 30 years. I don't just specialise in barbel. I fish most coarse fish. I would disagree with you on two things. One, barbel are probably one of the hardest fighting coarse fish going. So they would have no problem going up a salmon run. And they literally will hug the bottom of the weir, no problem at all. So they're very strong swimmers. I think the thing about breeding as well, I've seen them in the Avon going downstream to breed. If you go to the Priory in April and in May, there's about 150 odd fish down there. You're spot on with the gravel because obviously they like that, but they do go downstream as well for breeding. I think breeding areas are quite, and that's a good area for tagging as well, because there's a lot of fish together when that happens for your tagging. The thing I was picking up on really was the reason the differences in the fish, and I fished your rivers as well as Avon and Severn and the Stour, is food. Barbel are very much, I'd call them on elderberries, blackberries, so natural baits. And I think they're a bit like carp. They're getting used. They're not going for the pellets now because every fisherman uses pellets. It's a standard sort of thing, and fish get very sort of weary of that. So natural baits, and they follow the seasons as well. So that's probably why, if you have a look at when you send your drones out, look at the bushes on the side as well and see what's growing. So those are my thoughts. That's all.
Yeah, definitely. There's some great footage that Jack Perks has of chub eating blackberries out of the river. It's really cool. Yeah, we found when we looked at the isotopes, we had some fish that had up to 70% of the diet was made up of fish pellets. And we're taking the edge of the scale. So it looks at kind of like 2 years of growth. So it doesn't take into account the seasonal variation. But like you say, that could be really different at different times of year. There's not so many kind of natural foods around in the winter like the invertebrates. So it could be that maybe during the winter they fill up on these baits where there's not any kind of natural foods around. But yeah, really good points.
Okay, there's a couple of questions round about the effect that the barbel might have on other fish species. So one of the questions was, do they feed on the eggs and larvae of Atlantic salmon and sea trout? And do you think that might have an influence on the population numbers of those fish?
Yeah, I don't think that they would kind of actively seek them out, but yeah, they definitely are feeding within the gravels. So if a fish was spawning in front of them, I think they might, you know, ingest some salmon or sea trout eggs. Generally, the salmon and sea trout spawn further upstream than the kind of barbel area. So the barbel zone is often thought of as like the middle and lower reaches of a river. And the good, like prime kind of salmonid spawning habitat is generally in a slightly different area. So it's not really been a huge concern about overlap in that respect. And then, yeah, I saw another question was around, would it affect shad spawning habitat?
Yeah, that was the next one I was going to ask you.
Yeah, which is a really interesting question. So on the River Teme, the riffles where the barbel spawn are exactly the same habitat where we find shad eggs. So they both like a really similar habitat, although it's kind of hard to know because it's downstream of the barrier. So whether they're all spawning there because it's prime habitat or because they couldn't get any further and then they eventually decided to spawn there, it's a bit hard to tell at the moment. Hopefully post restoration we might be able to disentangle the two a bit more. But barbel are actually, when they're spawning, they're kind of cleaning the gravel and removing some of the really fine sediment, which is not very helpful for egg production. And they found in some studies for salmon that the earlier salmon that go in and clean it actually help for future salmon. So there might be an element of competition, but there could also be an element of helping each other out with improving the sediment. But shad actually generally don't spawn kind of within the gravel, they more spawn on top of it and just in the water column. So they wouldn't be kind of so affected by the barbel affecting the habitat, if that makes sense. The shad eggs will just drift further downstream and eventually settle on top of the gravel. But yeah, really interesting question.
And there was another one about movement patterns and whether or not you've been able to pick up any sex differences in the movement patterns.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I really want to look at next. And we've actually bought an ultrasound so that we can scan the fish's bellies and look at whether there's eggs within there or whether there's not. It's quite hard to tell externally from barbel whether they're male or female, although a few people think that they have a good idea about it. So yeah, I'm hoping that that'll be something we can do with the next ones that we tag. The ones that we tagged this September and October just gone, we scanned those, and I'm just waiting to learn how to interpret ultrasound images. It's all kind of grainy and black and white and seems like a mystery at the moment, but it's definitely the next stop on the research map.
I was going to say all the transferable skills we pick up along the way.
Yeah.
There's one about, I'm not sure, you probably know more about it than I do. There's a question about tiers that have been put into a gauging station with a tier, and the tiers are most seriously designed obstacle to fish passage. How does one start the process of tier removal to help fish passage arrangements?
That's from David, isn't it? Is that tiers or weirs, I wonder? Oh, you're muted, David. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, rather than me trying to.
Tell us what your question is. I don't know this, the Dowells Brook myself.
The other thing you can do, David, is push the space bar.
Thank you for that help. Your help and my discovery came simultaneously. Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming I pressed the W on each time, but it says tier. It is actually a weir. I do mean weir. And I have some fishing rights in Dowells Brook, which is a tributary of the Severn, which is just upstream from Bewdley. Historically, it's been a salmon brook. You know, the record salmon up there in the sort of mid 20th century was sort of 60 pounds. You know, and I mean, how they get up there, I don't know, but they do, or they did. But on the piece of water I fish, there is this gauging station, which is an online station. Anyone can go on and see the height of the brook and all the sort of data that is available there. But it is an extreme barrier to the fish, and it is maybe half a mile from the Severn. There is another 5 or 6 miles of Dowells Brook that goes off into the Wyre Forest, which is really beautiful, fast-flowing riffles, which presumably anything coming in from the Severn can't get to, unless, as you said earlier, that the brook is in deep flood, and just by chance they can get over this weir. But it's just a straight line, concrete, 45-degree slab. Normally with an inch or two of water running over it, and maybe 10 feet long. So I suspect there's not many barbel up there, to be frank, but nevertheless it is an important part, for me anyway, of fish passage up the river. And I wondered how you would make a start in addressing that problem.
Yeah, I know that. So obviously it takes a huge amount of effort to remove these barriers. So they have to find the pockets of money from other places. But I think there does seem to be like a lot of barriers are being removed. So there's certainly will to remove the barriers that are redundant. Obviously the example I gave, Poet Weir, wasn't really being used for anything. I don't know much about the technicalities of what the agency might need for a gauging station, because often they might need a certain level of water or pressure or something for their equipment. But there's lots of kind of new technologies being designed that can be freestanding. Like we've recently deployed a river level gauge that is just a remote piece of kit that doesn't need any kind of barrier in it. But whether that's maybe not as accurate as the systems that they're using, I don't really know. But yeah, I've put my email in the chat. I could potentially follow up on that with you and find out about what the possibilities are or what the requirements are for that gauging station, and see if there's any interest in removing it. Because like you say, salmon are a really important fish to protect. And so if it can provide extra spawning habitat for them, I'm sure there could be some will to do that.
Okay, I'd look forward to anything that would help me along. Thank you.
Great. There's another interesting one as well. I don't know how many you've come across, but Peter's asking about crayfish numbers, and could the crayfish, invasive crayfish, be influencing barbel numbers?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that they have any signal crayfish in the river Teme yet. I think they have got some in some of the other smaller tributaries around there. So yeah, they're definitely nearby. It's interesting because I've seen in a few papers that they say that crayfish will eat lots of fish eggs and barbel eggs. But actually, when you track down the citations, I've never been able to find the actual study that found that. So I'm not sure if it's actually really been observed or properly kind of quantified. But a colleague of mine, Taya, who also did her PhD at Bournemouth, she found that barbel were able to eat crayfish. And so actually could be the other way around. It could just be another thing that they eat. They seem to have a quite varied diet. So yeah. Although obviously the signal crayfish is not ideal for the native crayfish and for other reasons, but I'm not sure they would have a big impact on a barbel population.
At least that's some good news. Rich Arthur's got his hand up. Do you want to ask your question, Rich?
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, I'm never very sure of these things. I don't know if you got the video. There's a still from it behind me. There's a 3-4 barbel in there. I fished for many years in a river just the other side of Bath, which was absolutely stuffed with barbel, huge barbel, which we used to watch very regularly. And we would sort of say, well, we caught that one last week. We won't bother with that one. We'll just target that one over there. Oh, no, we caught that one the week before. And it was just magical. You could not in just the fact that I'm a fisherman, but I actually enjoyed looking at the nature. And I used to go there and sort of, I would catch sort of a dozen in 3 or 4 hours. And I took my friend there once, and he said, "I've never caught a barbel." Oh, I tell you that we simply cannot fail. We did. I think it was about 2005. I'm not sure, and the fish vanished. And I've never seen another fish in that river since. A few have been caught, not very many, but you just don't see them. They also vanished from the Bristol Avon, and the elephant in the room, which nobody's mentioned, is predation. And I don't think any study's been done on, the impact of introducing huge numbers of otters. I mean, there is a rumor. I thought they'd introduced 2 otters into the Iford stretch. And curiously, the people in the manor that were behind it very rapidly lost their koi carp out of their pond, very many thousands of pounds in the space of a week. But I have heard that something like 12 otters were put in. And in Bristol, we have seen them in the high streets. We've seen them walking up and down. I've seen them walking up and down the motorways. They're in the bridges and so on. So these are not natural otters. I've been studying an otter family for probably 25 years and saw one once, a fleeting glimpse. I saw the footprints and everything else. And all of a sudden, these otters are everywhere. And I just wonder what studies have been done to actually see what the impact has been on the fish. It's really heartening to hear that there are otters still in the team. There are barbels still in the team. But how long that's going to remain, I don't know. They could disappear overnight. I warn you, they really could. There are people who regard animals above the surface with much greater respect than animals below the surface. And I'd love to talk to you about this. What I would like to see is funding from the people who like furry things to actually put a lot more barbel back in, and the chub have vanished as well. These things are voracious, and it's so nice to hear someone who's supporting fish. So I hope we can maybe work together on this, because I'd love to see, I'd love to see the otters. It's just that we can't seem to have them, both of them. There's a balance which is being destroyed. So
yes, it's a really good question. And you mentioned the kind of decline of barbel back from 2005. I've just trying to write a paper at the moment, which is based on angling records, looking at the decline of barbel. And in the team, the Severn, kind of where I've been researching, there did seem, because sometimes there's a worry that maybe you don't remember things like really clearly, or there's this kind of memory of the heyday. But when we looked at the data, there was a significant decline, and we've not really seen any kind of increase in the numbers yet. What the cause of that is, I really still don't know. It's so hard to disentangle from past data what's causing that decline. But the anglers in the stretch that I was looking at also mentioned otters, and were worried that could be a big cause in the decline. So I did, during my whole PhD and even my postdoc, whenever I've been back there, I've always tried to find otter sprain so that I could look at which fish scales were in there, because obviously the scales and bones and things remain, so you can identify the species of fish that they've eaten, but also you can look at the age of fish and maybe estimate the kind of sizes that might be being removed. And I asked all of the anglers to keep their eye out for any spraints, and I think I saw one spraint there in the kind of 5 years that I was really regularly frequenting these kind of 2 stretches. And actually one of them was just downstream of the weir, and it was actually full of shad scales. So maybe some of the fish that get stuck below the weir where they're maybe trying to pass, they then become maybe an easy target to predators. But generally predators and prey kind of balance out over time, because as soon as you have a boom in a predator, and then you get this bust in prey, you should then get the bust in predators afterwards. So they should naturally kind of follow each other in an up and down pattern. So yeah, I would definitely, if people found sprain and were able to collect samples, it's something you can certainly look at. But I've yet to actually find the samples with lots of big barbel scales in them.
I'm a bit too old to see the recovery. I'd love to see them back again, but I think the problem with otters is I mean, if you just Google fish damage, otter damage, you'll see that all they do is they rip the throat out of a fish and leave this huge fish on the bank. It's a bit like a fox in a hen coop. So you get this massive collapse in big fish, and then you get this low level. I noticed that most of the barbel you were showing were quite small, and they're obviously quite frightened. They hide away. But
yeah, a lot of predators will take the most kind of nutritious, tissues of an animal. So yeah, I guess that's not super rare predatory behaviour.
Yeah. Have you seen the video of the otters in Salisbury in winter time?
No.
You should look at that. And they're just actually in the town centre, just chomp, 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 chomp. And then one lady says, "Oh, look, there's a stranded salmon. There's a dead salmon. It's having a go at that." Well, I'm afraid it didn't die of natural causes in that sense. It is tricky. But
Yeah.
I think we do need. One thing is, I hope I'm not holding up things, but one thing is I've actually offered to do electrofishing. We used to have in our river. We used to have a regular electrofish survey from the EA, and they used to say, "Oh, you've got a 10-pounder in this one, and oh, you've got that in there," and they were really pleased, and then all of a sudden it stopped. And so I said, "Well, look, we really need to know, if these barbel have disappeared because of the pollution, we need to know, we need to do an electrofishing survey." And they said, "Oh no, we can't do that. There's no money." I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll pay for it. I'm sure I can find 10 members of the club who will each chip in a few £100, and we'll do an electrofishing survey." And the quote I got back from the EA was, "That won't do you any good, sir." "Oh, why is that?" I said, "We've lost all the records." I think the word fishy is appropriate here. But do you have any electrofishing records going back?
A lot of the Environment Agency data is kind of freely available on their website portals now. But yeah, I've got some kind of historical electric fishing data from the river team, and I've trying to kind of match that up with the angling records that I've got. So yeah, it's useful to have both types of data available.
Thank you.
I think just kind of on that note as well, there's a comment about sewage discharge going into the rivers and that affecting water quality, and how much do you think that affects your numbers?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not an expert on water quality, but it's been in the media a lot recently about this kind of like discharges happening, especially when there's heavy rainfall and our kind of existing systems get overwhelmed, and then the kind of untreated effluent makes its way into the river. And yeah, what's really interesting is obviously there's kind of like a nutrient impact of that then might cause things like algal blooms, but there's all kinds of other things in our effluent, like our washing powder, and they've even found kind of studies of looking at drugs that have passed through people's systems, whether they might be antidepressants or like kind of what's the word, the kind of contraceptive pills and even recreational drugs like cocaine, and they think that all of those things have an effect on different fish in different ways. So yeah, I mean, I don't specifically know what damage they're having, but it's certainly worrying, and especially if it's happening, you know, on lots of rivers, which it seems like it is. But then I guess there's also monitoring being done on that, so that's good. But yeah, there are so many things to research. You can't necessarily know about them all, but no, it's certainly a concern.
That's part of it, isn't it? Especially in an ecosystem like that, there's so many different elements that are coming into play that there's only so many things that you can look at one point in time.
Yeah, definitely. So many factors to think about.
There's another question about what's the impact of sediment flushing from structure removal on food availability and type.
Yeah, so obviously, so yeah, I was talking about the kind of eggs need to be in a nice clean gravel. That's ideally what would happen. And talking about sediment flushing, yeah, it was actual sediment flushing was something that the Environment Agency had been using on the River Ouse, and they'd found it to be quite effective at removing the fine sediment. But it's a very much, it seems like a short-term fix in that, you know, in the short term, it would remove the sediment. So if you did it just before spawning, it could be ideal. But over time, if that fine sediment was coming into the catchment, whether it's from fields that are left bare, or sometimes it happens when the kind of cows go into the water to drink, the kind of trampling of the sediment makes it go into the riverbeds. Does that answer the question? I don't know. Can't see where that one is. There's so many now. I've lost.
It's right at the end. It's from Robin.
Oh, and how would it affect food availability and type? Yeah, I guess it might change the type of invertebrates that live there, but hopefully the invertebrates that come, presumably there'll be more invertebrates can live within the clean gravels, as that's kind of what's naturally there. So hopefully it would still provide plenty of food for the different life stages of fish that are there. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's all the questions that are there at the moment. Does anybody else have any other questions? Am I missing anybody that's got their hand up or anything?
Oh, I can see one from James, who was a recent graduate. How would he get involved in such projects? He's recently seen a lot of webinars with the Unlocking the Severn project. Yeah, so obviously with COVID, it's been difficult to get people to volunteer in person. But normally there is a lot of in-person volunteering with the Unlocking the Severn project. They have one weir where they have a kind of white base, so people can go and sit and count the migrating shad as they go up over the weir. But also on the Unlocking the Severn website, they have video footage, and they're trying to get citizen scientists, because they've got so much footage to watch. So you watch the videos yourself, and then at the end of it, you say, oh, you saw this many fish, this kind of species, and how many of them managed to get over the weir. So yeah, there's definitely things that everybody can get involved in, and hopefully we'll be up there. So if you're a university graduate, I'm sure you'll be able to come along with the research team and help us with some tagging as well. You have to send me an email.
Sounds like a good way of getting us all to go to sleep now as well. We're giving up on sheep. We're going to start counting fish.
Start counting fish, yeah, ideal.
I think Barry's had his hand up. Barry, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. There's been a suggestion that they might install a tidal barrier at the end of the estuary, the Bristol estuary, and they use it for power generation. And the RSPB says this is going to affect wildlife up and down the river. Will it affect the fish migration as well? Has any consideration been taken to the possible introduction of a tidal barrier for power generation?
Yeah, so I think you'd be talking about something like the Severn barrier happening in the lower parts of the river. It would certainly seem strange to spend so much money on removing all these barriers upstream if, like you say, a big barrier was to be put in the lower river. I know there's lots of technologies now about kind of free floating turbines, so whether there's a way that they can do it without kind of creating a barrier across the whole estuary, or whether they would be able to have kind of spaces where fish could pass through. I don't know, but yeah, there's a lot of concerns about turbines in the water, not just about physically maybe cutting fish, which does happen with turbines, but also sometimes if they pass through at the edges, they can get kind of a bit like divers get the bends where they get bubbles in their blood from the different pressure in the tissues. That can also happen to fish, so they can get kind of pressure wounds. So yeah, there's definitely multiple issues for fish migration to be considered with that.
Thank you.
I have put my hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute there. I was just introducing you.
Oh, thank you. My question really only refers to the small number of numbers in your data. And I'm wondering how far you can extrapolate that to total populations of fish.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we obviously the first time we tagged 22 and the second 20, and we're really lucky that the environmental conditions happen to be quite comparable between those 2 years. And yeah, we're trying to tag a further 20 at the moment. So in each individual study, it's not a huge number, but by the end of this year in total, we will have tagged 62 barbel. And during that time as well, which is interesting, where we've electric fished the lower team several times, we've only recaptured one of the fish. So within one area of the kind of lower team in the Severn, we've got at least 62 fish that we've been tracking over quite a long time period. And yeah, like you say, so that's not the only method. We're also looking at things like angler catch data, working with the Environment Agency, looking at some of their data that they collected. And I've also done a lot of kind of larval surveys where we seine net and look at the juvenile fish, where we have much bigger sample sizes. So yeah, definitely in a standalone, each project is very small, but we're hoping that when we put everything together, we'll have quite a good picture about the population down there.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just checking the chat again. I think, Rich, did you have another question?
Oh, I've always got plenty of questions.
Yeah, but we do need to finish at some point tonight.
Very quickly about well, beavers, I suppose. But have you done any work with the Ephemoptera, the mayflies? They're the kind of canary in the coal mine for rivers. They sort of indicate the environment. And what I've discovered in all of the research that I've found so far, and you can tell me if it's wrong, I haven't seen anything which deals with the effects of barbel dam, beaver dams on the upper reaches. And I've been to the Tetons in the USA, just south of Yellowstone National Park, and we camped there. And they said, oh, you can walk anywhere there you like, that's fine. And I said, well, that's just grass and fields. What about the river over that? Oh, no, you can't get anywhere near the river. This is the Grossmont. And it's huge. It's about 7 or 8 miles across, and it's an enormous. I said, well, which bit of it I can't go? Oh, you can't go any of it. It's so dangerous because we have had people killed with barked trees, the eaten trees, and they leave them standing. And the devastation that we're going to be storing up by putting, the problem I see is that climate change is something that we're told is a problem because it's happening too fast. It's happening over probably 100 years. What we're doing with things like introducing otters and introducing the beavers is we're doing it in the space of 10 years, and everybody's going, oh, what a good idea. And instead of waiting and seeing what the actual effect is going to be, we're going to have such a big problem. And we're basically condemning a lot of these beavers to be killed because there's nothing going to control their numbers. And they can't keep on growing, and you can't keep translating them somewhere else because they're already, from what I can see, they're trying to put beavers in virtually every river system. And all these sort of beaver dams are going to come crashing down in floods, and people are going to have to be sort of taking the stuff out.
I don't think we've not quite got them on every river yet.
Yeah,
I've seen that they've just introduced some into Dorset. So I think there's one pair in the whole of Dorset at the moment. But I mean, I'm not involved in any beaver restoration projects. So like I say, I don't have any specific experience in it. But what I've seen or what I've heard is that they're actually being done in a really closely monitored way. They have to be put in these very fenced in enclosures so that they can monitor the effects of them, like you say, before anything happens. So it does seem like they're getting a good amount of data on how it's going so far. So it'd be interesting to see what the effects of that is.
Well, that was true, but the results of if you look at the beaver survey, the results is that they've done this in these enclosures, and they've said, oh, it's fine. Now we can release them from the enclosures. So we've moved on from there, and they've talked about putting otters in the test. They're putting otters in the rivers in Wales. Not otters. They're
beavers.
putting otters and beavers in all these places, and I don't think they're doing sufficient research. They're certainly to leave out the mayflies, because they're saying, oh yes, you've got great diversity because you're damming up the rivers and you're making a muddy puddle. Well, that's great. It's dead easy to make muddy puddles. What's difficult is to keep a beautiful, clean, flowing stretch of river through, and clean gravels, which we've seen in your pictures, which is great. But we need more research. We need more and more pressure to have good research, I think.
I'm with you on that one. I'm all for more research.
Yes,
on all topics ecology.
Yeah.
I've just seen a few more messages coming in the chat. Somebody says, why barbel? What's the particular significance of having barbel inhabiting a river? Yeah, I was mentioning about them needing that really clean gravel, and that can be useful for lots of different spawning species. So they can be a good indicator of just the quality of the gravels in a river. And also just because they like quite fast flowing natural water, they can also be a good indicator of connectivity.
There's another one about Larney passage structures, and I don't know, Amiana, do you want to actually ask your question? We've got somebody.
I don't mind, I've been able to read it, but yeah, Amiana, if you did want to add anything else, you're welcome to.
No, that's all I have. I'm across the pond in California, USA. Thank you so much for this awesome. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. But Lurinier structures, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, seem to be more and more common in UK fish passage designs. But those types of structures are not, have not been implemented here in the United States, but they seem to be successful in the UK. And I'm just curious, do you know about fish passage success with Lurinier structures, particularly with maybe weaker swimming fish, not the the big muscular salmonids?
Yeah, I don't know specifically about the individual structure types, but I think somebody's posted some links to the Unlocking the Severn. They've got a whole series of talks that are all happening now, free online, and they've got some real experts on the different structures of fish passages, and so maybe there'll be some good information there. But I also met somebody at a conference, I don't know if he's in here actually, he's called Angus, I think his surname is Lothian, and he was looking at barbel and their passage through certain fish passages. I'm just Googling his name to see if his research comes up. Yeah, he was at Durham University. So some of his papers might interest you.
Okay, good.
I'll just pop the link in the chat now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for joining us from so far away.
It's okay. It's lunchtime here. It's good timing.
Oh, good. That's a nice time to have a talk.
Okay, I think with our international guest having to join, we'll let you get back to your lunch.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so can I just ask everybody to show their appreciation? If you go to your reactions, there's a little hand clap that we can say thank you to Katie, and well done. Thanks for a very interesting talk. And yeah, thank you everybody that's joined us. and I hope you all enjoyed the talk, and we'll perhaps see you for another Cafe Sci at some point in time. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for the great questions.